Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. In this lecture we will discuss a critical work written by T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent. The bottom line of this critical work is that a good poet must write not only about present but give some references from past, and his work must be followed by the principles, by the rules created by the ancient writers. So while defining, first of all, he talks about concept of tradition, where he says that a poet who wants to write good poetry, a present poet who wants to write good poetry, he must follow the rules, the principles created by the ancient writers. And he says that if a poet wants to write a good poetry, he cannot write a good poetry in isolation. In isolation here means in separation, here means that when he is writing something, he has to give some references from the history. He has to take help from the ancient writers. He has to use the rules created by the ancient writers, but it is not compulsory on every present writer, every present poet, but there must be a good connection must be developed between uh, present and past works of literature, literary works. And he also says that the good piece of work, good poetry, good literary work is the one that carries good historical events, and it always gives a sense of knowledge and sense of reading by the poet, the one who is writing poetry. If he has read history, if he has good knowledge about ancient writers, that will definitely be reflected in his present poetry. So that reflection will create genius and excellent work of the present writers. Then he talks about interdependence. He says that a good literary work is always a mixture of present and past, that we are already discussing, that writing only about the present and separating it from the past, it will never create a good impact on the mind of the readers. So he must take some references from history. He must create a sense of historical events. He must create a sense, a reflection, a sense and reflection of the ancient writers, those who have already written about that particular genre of literature, specifically poetry. And while he's saying, he's emphasizing that the present writers, they must follow the ancient writers, the rules created by the ancient writers, he clarifies by saying that every new writer, every present writer must create a new idea. Following the principles of the ancient writers or giving historical references does not mean that the present writers they start copying the previous writers. The ideas of the previous writers must not be copied, must not be followed exactly and similarly. The idea must be given by the poet, by the writer, but how that idea should be composed and should be written effectively. So, to write that idea in an effective manner, to write in a good poetry, the writer must follow the principles created by the previous writers. So, here it is important to mention that it is not compulsory that every rule and every principle must be followed what has been already created by the ancient writers. It means that if a new present writer wants to write poetry and he wants to write in his own style, he can write, but creating altogether a new idea, it will never give a good impression on the readers. So the poet will not be able to create a good and excellent work unless he takes help from the ancient writers and he gives historical references. Then he talks about historical sense, that the past works, they are always a guide for the present writers. It is very much similar, it is based on a common sense based idea that everyone who is going to do something, he must follow his seniors, he must follow those who have already experienced it. Those who have experienced it, they may have faced many difficulties, and when you get complete idea about something, you may avoid those difficulties to bring perfection in your work, or to bring perfection. I'm not talking about literature here, I'm talking about our daily routine life. Like you try to go somewhere as completely blank about the knowledge of the place and knowledge about the people where you are going. That will definitely be difficult for you to go there and adjust yourself. But once you have some sort of some sort of knowledge by the person who has already experienced that place and people, so it would be easy for you to adjust at that place instead of going through the same trial which the others have already gone. And then he talks about he compares the past and the present work, and he says that the new features introduced by the modern writers, they must be introduced also, that there are many new rules which have been created by the modern writers. And the modern writers, they must have critical thinking about the past work. It is based on common sense that whenever you are writing something, you try to do something, we always try to take some help from the previous writers. Like, in a simply, if you want to search something, like you can say a terminology of any branch of linguistics or literature or any other branch of knowledge, what we do, we try to download the relevant research papers, we try to download the relevant research books written on it, or some general books written on it. So those written the books those written on the same topic, they give us some sort of knowledge which actually clarifies our mind that what we are going to do. It creates ease for us, it creates a comfort level for us to write good poetry, or to do not to write, sorry, good poetry, but to do our work effectively. Then he says that there must not be any discrimination between a very great poet and a very small poet. A great poet means widely read by the people, and an ordinary poet means who is not widely read by the poet. So all the poets, all the writers, those who are writing something, some literary piece of work, they must be appreciated equally. Then he talks about theory of impersonality. First of all, he rejects the poetry, rejects definition of poetry by Wordsworth. And what was the definition of poetry by Wordsworth? Like spontaneous overflow of ideas. Wordsworth talks about emotions, about nature, about permanent beauty of nature, and he also talks about common objects. He also talks about rustic language, rustic ideas. And he says that poetry, T.S. Eliot says that the emotions of the poet, they must not be reflected in his poetry, because if a poet reflects his own emotions into poetry, it means that there may be a sense of being biased by the poet. A poet must be neutral while writing his ideas, according to T.S. Eliot. And poet must create his work by the ideas in his mind, by collecting the ideas instead of expressing his own emotions. Then he says that personality of the poet must not be reflected in the poetry, which I have already explained, that his own mind, his own emotions, his own personality. His own personality means that if he likes something, if he dislikes something, that must not be reflected into his poetry. His whatever the poet likes, it may be disliked by all the people, all the readers. Or the poet, if he dislikes something, it may be liked by all the readers. So the emotions of the poet does not matter. Actually, the perception of the readers matter, that how the readers will perceive this poetry. And then he says that to the created work by the poet, surrender to the created work by the poet. And he says that his of the which I have already explained, that the emotions of the poet must not be reflected into poetry. If the emotions are reflected, that work will not create a good impression on the minds of the reader.